Imagine waking up and discovering your house is completely surrounded by 6 adult jaguars. No phone, no help, no escape. At 68 years old, Lucia Mendez was face to face with the most dangerous predators in the Americas. But what she did next defied all laws of nature and human logic. In 40 minutes, she transformed a situation of certain death into one of the most extraordinary stories of courage ever recorded. She didn't just survive, she earned the respect of these wild predators and unmasked a conspiracy that would change her life forever. But to understand how a retired veterinarian accomplished the impossible and became a living legend, we need to go back to the beginning of this story that challenges human nature itself. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? And if you love real stories that seem impossible, subscribe to the Wind Echo Untold channel. Because here, you'll discover stories that will make you question the limits of what is humanly possible. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any of these extraordinary narratives.
To fully understand this story, you need to know Lucia Mendez. At 68, she was no ordinary woman. A retired veterinarian, she had dedicated 2 full decades of her life to working at the Yucatan Animal Conservation Reserve in Mexico. Her home, isolated 15 kilometers from the nearest city, was strategically located on the edge of the forest. A deliberate choice by someone who had always preferred the company of animals to that of humans. Lucia had something few veterinarians possess: an almost mystical connection with wild felines. During her 20 years at the reserve, she had cared for hundreds of injured, orphaned, and rehabilitating animals. Her hands had healed jaguars, ocelots, pumas, and other large felines. But more than that, she understood their behaviors, their fears, their body language in a way that bordered on the supernatural. Lucia's retirement was not by her own choice. 6 months before this fateful night, she had discovered something terrible: systematic corruption at the reserve where she had worked for 2 decades. The new director, Sergio Vasquez, was involved in the illegal trafficking of animals, selling jaguar cubs to private collectors in zoos worldwide. When Lucia presented formal evidence to the authorities, she never imagined she was signing her own death warrant. Sergio wasn't just corrupt, he was vengeful and dangerous. And on this October night in 2023, he would put a revenge plan into action that no sane mind could have imagined. Lucia lived alone by choice. Her only company was 2 domestic cats, Luna and Sol, and a simple routine: waking at dawn, tending to her small vegetable garden, reading books on animal behavior, and corresponding with veterinary colleagues around the world. She had chosen isolation as a form of peace after decades of dealing with human cruelty toward animals. But on the night of October 15th, that peace would be shattered in a way she could never have predicted.
It was 5:47 in the morning when Lucia woke up to a sound she couldn't identify. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't her cats, it was something different. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Her experience with large felines made all her instincts flare up simultaneously. She got out of bed slowly, trying not to make a sound. She walked to the bedroom window, and as she slightly moved the curtain, her heart stopped for a full second. 6 adult jaguars completely surrounded her house. These were not lost or disoriented animals. They moved with purpose, patrolling the perimeter of her property like soldiers in a siege formation. The largest of them, an imposing male weighing at least 120 kilograms, was positioned right in front of the main door. A deep scar on his left ear made him easily recognizable. Lucia felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew that scar. "Baloo," she whispered to herself. 15 years ago, this same animal had arrived at the reserve as an orphaned cub, injured and traumatized. Lucia had spent months caring for him, bottle feeding him, treating his wounds, and teaching him how to hunt. The scar on his ear was the result of an attack by other animals before he was rescued. Lucia was there when he took his first steps after surgery. She was there when he ate his first prey. She was there when he was reintroduced to the wild, and now Baloo was back. But something was terribly wrong. Jaguars are solitary animals by nature. Seeing 6 of them together, organized, surrounding a human house, that simply does not happen in the wild. Lucia, with all her experience, knew this was impossible unless someone had orchestrated this situation. She ran to the landline phone. The line was dead. She picked up her cell phone. No signal. Panic began to set in as she realized it wasn't a coincidence. Someone had sabotaged her communications. Someone wanted her to be completely isolated, completely vulnerable. And that's when she heard human voices approaching.
Lucia stepped back from the window and tried to think rationally, but her heart was beating so fast she could hear it echoing in her ears. 20 years of working with wild felines had prepared her for many situations, but never for something like this. Never for being a prisoner in her own home, held by animals she herself had helped raise. The voices outside grew clearer. She immediately recognized the arrogant and cruel tone of Sergio Vasquez. "Perfect," Sergio shouted to his accomplices. "Look how well-behaved our little friends are. The old lady must be scared to death by now." Lucia felt a burning fury surge through her veins. Sergio had not only stolen from and corrupted the institution to which she had dedicated her life, he was now using the very animals she loved as weapons against her. The cruelty of this revenge was almost incomprehensible. She needed to act, but every attempt seemed impossible. She tried to approach the front door to confront Sergio directly, but Baloo lifted his head and let out a low growl that made her retreat immediately. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was a warning, as if he was saying, "Don't come out yet." She tried the back door. 2 smaller females completely blocked that exit, moving in perfect synchronization. She tried the windows. Other jaguars patrolled every possible escape route. It was then that Lucia noticed something extraordinary. The animals weren't there to hurt her. They were following orders, yes, but there was something deeper happening. The way Baloo had looked at her through the window was not with hostility. It was almost protective. During her first hour of captivity, Lucia carefully observed every move the felines made. Her experience was whispering something her rational mind rejected. These animals were conflicted. They had been trained to keep her trapped, but their natural instincts were fighting against this artificial programming. She decided to run a test. Lucia went to her refrigerator and took out small pieces of fresh meat she kept for her domestic cats. She slightly opened the kitchen window, just enough to fit her hand through, and tossed a piece toward one of the smaller females. The reaction was immediate and revealing. The jaguar took the meat, but instead of becoming more aggressive, she backed up a few steps and sat down. This wasn't the behavior of a hungry or hostile predator. It was the behavior of a trained animal responding to a familiar stimulus. As she watched the jaguars feed, Lucia made a discovery that completely changed her understanding of the situation. The 6 jaguars weren't random animals from the reserve. They had been specifically chosen. Besides Baloo, she recognized 3 others: Itzel, a female she had treated for a serious eye infection; Kukulkan, a young male she had helped recover from a broken paw; and Ikshel, a female who had been rejected by her own mother and raised almost entirely by Lucia. Sergio hadn't chosen these jaguars by chance. He had purposely selected the animals with whom Lucia had the deepest emotional connection. This wasn't just an attempt at intimidation. It was calculated psychological torture. Sergio knew that seeing these animals being used against her would be more painful than any physical threat. But there was something Sergio didn't know, something his arrogance and cruelty prevented him from understanding. The connection between Lucia and these felines was much deeper than he imagined. It wasn't just professional. It was almost maternal, and that connection worked both ways. Lucia realized that Baloo wasn't just following orders. Every time Sergio and his accomplices got too close to the house, Baloo positioned himself between them and the main door.
as if he were protecting Lucia, not keeping her prisoner. The other jaguar showed similar behaviors. They were there not out of aggression, but out of confusion and conflicting loyalty. It was then that she heard Sergio yelling at one of his accomplices. "They're too calm. Where are the sedatives? We should have given them a smaller dose. They need to look more threatening." Sedatives. Sergio had drugged the animals to make them more controllable, but he had also miscalculated the dosage. The jaguars were under the influence of substances that altered their natural behaviors, but not enough to completely erase their affectionate memories of Lucia. This revelation changed everything. Lucia realized she had a very specific window of opportunity. The effects of the sedatives would eventually wear off, and when they did, the situation could become truly dangerous. She had perhaps 2 or 3 hours before the animals returned to their natural state. And jaguars in a natural, confused, and disoriented state would be unpredictable even for her. With this new information, Lucia formulated a plan that was simultaneously brilliant and completely insane. She couldn't wait for a rescue. She had to rescue herself. And to do that, she would have to use not only her knowledge of feline behavior, but also her understanding of Sergio's psychology. First, she needed to find a way to communicate with the outside world without Sergio knowing. Her house was old, built in the 1970s, and had a few quirks she had forgotten until this moment of desperation. In the basement, hidden behind a shelf of old books, there was a secondary landline phone that had been installed by the previous owner and never removed. Sergio and his men, who had only sabotaged the main lines, were unaware of its existence. The challenge was getting to the basement. To do this, she would have to leave the house, walk around to the back of the property where the basement entrance was, and do it all without alerting either the jaguars or Sergio's men. But Lucia had an advantage Sergio had underestimated. She knew these animals better than anyone alive. She knew exactly how each one would react to specific stimuli, even under the influence of sedatives. She began to implement her plan with surgical precision. First, she used more pieces of meat to strategically move the jaguars away from the back door, not randomly. She knew that its cell always preferred to eat in elevated places, so she threw meat near a tree that was 20 meters from the house. She knew Kukulkan was territorial about food, so she threw a piece in the opposite direction so he would go and instinctively defend that temporary territory. In 15 minutes of careful maneuvering, Lucia had created an escape corridor of approximately 10 meters between the back door and the basement entrance. It would be dangerous. It would be fast, but it was possible. She put on her quietest sneakers, grabbed a small flashlight, and prepared for the most important race of her life. At 68 years old, Lucia was about to bet everything on her connection with animals that could tear her apart in seconds if she made a single mistake. But before leaving, she did something only someone with her experience and courage would do. She looked directly into Baloo's eyes through the window and whispered, "Trust me, my boy, just as I've always trusted you." The great feline slightly tilted his head, a gesture she knew well. It was his way of saying he understood.
It was 8:15 in the morning when Lucia silently opened the back door. Her heart was beating so fast she was certain everyone, men and jaguars, could hear it. But there was no turning back. It was now or never. The first step out of the house was the most terrifying of her life. Immediately, all 6 jaguars turned their attention to her. For a moment that felt like an eternity, predator and prey stared at each other in absolute silence. But Lucia did not run. Against all basic human instincts, she began to walk slowly, maintaining eye contact with each of the jaguars, using body language she had learned in 2 decades of work, a non-threatening posture, predictable movements, controlled breathing. Baloo stood up and began walking toward her. Sergio's accomplices, who were watching from a distance, began to shout in excitement, thinking they would finally see the spectacle of violence they expected. But what happened next defied all expectations. When Baloo got within 2 meters of Lucia, he did not attack. He sat down. He simply sat down and watched her,
as he used to do when he was a cub and learning his basic commands. One by one, the other jaguars began to do the same. Itzel, Kukulkan, Ichel, they all positioned themselves around Lucia, not as predators surrounding a prey, but as a family protecting their matriarch. Lucia continued walking toward the basement, and the jaguars accompanied her in a majestic and impossible procession. Sergio's men were in absolute shock. Sergio began shouting contradictory orders, completely out of control as he watched his revenge plan transform into the most extraordinary demonstration of human-animal connection ever witnessed. Reaching the basement entrance, Lucia did something only someone with her experience and intuition would do. She knelt down and extended her hand toward Baloo. The great feline approached and, for a few precious seconds, allowed her to touch his head, exactly as they did when he was a cub and learning his basic commands. "Thank you for protecting me," she whispered. "Now, give me a few minutes to fix this." Lucia quickly went down to the basement while the jaguars naturally positioned themselves around the entrance, like guardians. The phone was exactly where she remembered it. Her hands were shaking as she dialed the police. "Emergency. This is Lucia Mendez. I am being held prisoner in my home by Sergio Vasquez and 2 armed men. They used wild animals to intimidate me. My location is 40 minutes. The police would arrive in 40 minutes. But Sergio had heard movement in the basement and was getting nervous. Lucia could hear him shouting at his accomplices to position themselves better. It was then that Lucia made the bravest decision of her life. Instead of waiting hidden in the basement, she decided to confront Sergio directly, but not alone. She would emerge accompanied by her 6 feline guardians. When she emerged from the basement, the scene that unfolded was breathtaking. Lucia walked calmly toward Sergio, flanked by the 6 jaguars who now behaved like her personal soldiers. The great urban predator, Sergio, suddenly found himself face to face with the true predators of nature. "Sergio," Lucia said with a calm that even impressed herself, "the police are on their way. Your little revenge scheme not only failed, it just became evidence of multiple federal crimes." Sergio, who had always used intimidation and power as his weapons, was speechless upon seeing a 68-year-old woman commanding animals that could tear him to pieces in seconds. You're a witch," Sergio stammered, instinctively backing away. "I'm not a witch, Sergio. I'm just someone who understands that respect isn't earned with fear. It's earned with genuine love and care. Something you will never understand." The sound of sirens in the distance began to echo through the Mexican morning.
When the police cars arrived at Lucia's property, the officers were faced with a scene none of them had ever witnessed in their careers. An elderly woman sitting calmly on her porch, surrounded by 6 jaguars resting around her like giant domestic cats. Sergio and his 2 accomplices were hiding behind his car, more than 50 meters away, visibly terrified and unable to flee. The jaguars had instinctively blocked all their escape routes. The rescue operation was complex and delicate. Lucia, with her unparalleled expertise, personally coordinated the safe sedation of each animal. She knew the exact weight of each jaguar, knew which ones would react best to which types of tranquilizers, and was able to guide the police veterinarians so that no animal was harmed in the process. Baloo was the last to be sedated. Before allowing him to be tranquilized, he approached Lucia one last time and touched her hand with his snout, a gesture of farewell that brought tears to the veteran veterinarian's face. Sergio's arrest revealed a much broader corruption scheme than Lucia had originally discovered. During interrogations, the police found evidence of international wildlife trafficking,
falsification of conservation documents, and a network of illegal private zoos that spanned 3 countries. Sergio had used his position as director of the reserve not only to profit from the illegal sale of animals, but also to blackmail other employees and maintain a system of silence through intimidation. The attack on Lucia was just the tip of the iceberg of years of systematic environmental crimes. 3 weeks after the incident, Lucia received the call that would change the course of her retirement. The Mexican Ministry of the Environment, impressed not only with her courage, but also with her competence in exposing the corruption, offered her the temporary directorship of the Yucatan Animal Conservation Reserve. Lucia's condition for accepting the position was simple: total autonomy to reform the entire organization from the ground up. In 6 months, Lucia transformed a corrupted institution into a national model of animal care. She fired all employees involved in Sergio's scheme, implemented strict transparency protocols, and created an educational program that attracted visitors and researchers from all over the world. But her first and most important decision was about the fate of the 6 jaguars who had been her captors and, paradoxically, her protectors. After months of behavioral and medical evaluation, Lucia coordinated the transfer of Balú, Itzel, and Kukulkan to a semi-wild reserve in Tanzania, an international conservation program that offered the animals 50,000 hectares of natural habitat, but with regular medical supervision. The other 3 jaguars, who had shown greater adaptation to captivity, were transferred to a special section of the Mexican reserve, a 500-hectare space where they could live in monitored freedom, serving as ambassadors for their species for the educational program. 18 months after the incident, Lucia received the news that made her cry with joy. Balú had become a father in Tanzania. 2 healthy cubs born in the wild represented not only the continuity of his lineage, but also the validation that animals traumatized by human interference could, with proper care, return to their wild nature. At 71, Lucia's success in transforming the reserve caught the attention of the federal government. She was invited to lead a national program for the conservation of wild felines, a position that would allow her to implement her innovative methodologies throughout Mexico. She accepted without hesitation. For 2 years, Lucia traveled across the country, creating international partnerships, training new generations of veterinarians specializing in wild felines, and establishing conservation protocols that were adopted by other Latin American countries. At 73, when she finally retired for good, Lucia had transformed a terrible act of personal revenge into the opportunity to save thousands of animals and reform an entire national conservation system.
The story of Lucia Mendez teaches us something profound about the nature of true power and true courage. When Sergio decided to use the animals she loved as weapons against her, he failed to understand that he was, in fact, creating the perfect situation to demonstrate what happens when years of genuine care, respect, and love meet years of exploitation, cruelty, and greed. The difference between Lucia and Sergio wasn't just in their actions, it was in the fundamental philosophy of how they viewed animals, and by extension, life itself. Sergio saw felines as commodities, objects to be exploited for personal gain. Lucia saw them as sentient beings deserving of respect, care, and protection. When the moment of supreme test came, the animals themselves chose which side to take. They recognized not only who had cared for them in the past, but who genuinely cared for their well-being in the present. Lucia's courage wasn't just physical, although walking among 6 jaguars certainly requires extraordinary bravery. Her true courage was emotional and moral. At 68, when she could have chosen silence and safety, she chose to confront corruption. When she could have waited for a rescue, She chose to rescue herself. When she could have sought revenge against Sergio, she chose to transform the entire situation into an opportunity to reform a whole system. Today, more than 2 years after that terrifying dawn that turned into a historic triumph, Lucia's legacy continues to grow. The Yucatan Animal Conservation Reserve has become an international center of excellence. Veterinarians from dozens of countries go there to learn her techniques for rehabilitating wild felines. Baloo, now a father of 4 cubs in Tanzania, represents a pure genetic lineage of Mexican jaguars that contributes to the global diversity of the species. Without Lucia's intervention, this lineage could have been lost forever to Sergio's illegal scheme. The National Conservation Program implemented by Lucia has resulted in the creation of 12 new reserves specializing in wild felines, the rehabilitation of more than 300 animals, and the training of a new generation of conservationists who carry her values and methodologies. But perhaps Lucia's most important legacy is the living proof that age should never be seen as a limitation when it comes to making a difference in the world. At 68, she proved that a determined person can not only survive the impossible, but transform a situation of terror into an opportunity for global change. Sergio, on the other hand, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for wild animal trafficking, corruption, and attempted aggravated assault. His accomplices received lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation with the investigations that led to the dismantling of the entire international trafficking network. Lucia's isolated house, where it all began, has been transformed into a research center for wild feline behavior. She still lives there, now at 75, but no longer alone. The property is frequently visited by researchers, veterinary students, and conservationists from all over the world who come to learn from the woman who did the impossible, earn the respect and protection of the most feared predators in the Americas.
This was the extraordinary story of Lucia Mendez, the woman who transformed a situation of terror into a historic triumph of animal conservation. A story that reminds us that courage has no age, that genuine love for animals can literally save lives, and that one determined person can change the destiny of thousands of creatures. And you, what did you think of this unbelievable story? Was it inspiring? Emotional? Let me know in the comments which part impressed you the most. Was it when Lucia walked among the 6 jaguars? When they protected her from Sergio's men? Or when she decided to turn the whole situation into a life mission? I want to know your honest opinion on this story that challenges everything we think we know about the relationship between humans and wild animals. If you were moved by Lucia's courage, subscribe to the Wind Echo Untold channel now and turn on notifications. Here you'll find the most extraordinary stories of real people who did things that seem impossible. Stories that will make you believe in the limitless potential of a human being when guided by love, courage, and determination. Share this video with someone who needs inspiration today. Share it with someone who loves animals. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to make a difference in the world. Because here at Wind Echo Untold, we believe the best stories aren't fiction. They are the real stories of extraordinary people who transform the impossible into reality. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next story that will make you question the limits of what is humanly possible.